Thanks from that one.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to welcome you all here. We're excited to talk about this very timely topic about foreign assistance, as well as human rights and where we're going, because we are in quite a bit of a crisis and a challenging moment. So my name is Ambassador Susan Page. I am the director of the Weiser Diplomacy Center and a professor of practice at the Ford School and a professor from practice at the law school. So it is my pleasure to introduce the two stars of the moment. Amy Harris is going to first introduce Dr. Arthreya, and then Dr. Arthreya will speak, and then they will have a conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm really pleased also to see Dr. Harris's parents here today and her husband. I love just shouting people out like that. And welcome to all those who are listening and watching online. So Dr. Amy Harris is a lecturer at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Her research interests are in foreign aid, international development, public participation, and public contracting. She examines the relationship between foreign aid contracting and on-the-ground international development work. Her current research in this area looks at how government contracts influence participatory development approaches that seek to engage project beneficiaries in decision-making about aid activities. She uses qualitative and mixed methods approaches in her research, including fieldwork in developing countries. Prior to starting her PhD, Amy worked as a project manager in foreign aid implementation with Chemonics International, managing both U.S. Agency for International Development and World Bank projects. I should not keep saying Amy. Dr. Harris received her PhD from the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance in 2020, where she also received her MS degree. She has an MA from the Monterey Institute of International Studies and a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College. She's also fluent in Spanish. She received an award for excellence in teaching from the Evans School in 2017, after which she was an adjunct faculty member at Seattle University's Institute for Public Service. And she's a dear friend. So without further ado, Dr. Amy Harris.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that very in-depth, comprehensive, and slightly embarrassing introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming. And in particular, thank you to Dr. Bama Arthreya for being here today and to talking with us about this important topic. Dr. Arthreya served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Inclusive Growth, Partnerships, and Innovation, where she oversaw global portfolios related to gender equality, child protection, youth and development, and ensuring development benefits reach marginalized and underrepresented populations. She has been a senior leader in the public and nonprofit sectors and is an internationally recognized expert on labor and trade, gender and social inclusion, and business and human rights. She led interagency and multilateral engagement on several issues and has represented the U.S. government in delegations to the UN General Assembly, Commission on the Status of Women, G20, and COP28. Under her leadership, USAID had advanced important new work to strengthen care infrastructure globally and promote gender-equitable digital development, including work to mitigate technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Prior to her appointment to USAID in early 2022, she held an Economic Inequality Fellowship with the Open Societies Foundation focused on the digital economy and served as a senior advisor to the Lattice Foundation. Past positions include her prior position at USAID as a senior specialist for labor, where she worked on new policy guidance and assisted USAID missions around the world to develop programming to address labor rights, counter human trafficking, and promote women's economic empowerment. She has also worked for the Solidarity Center, International Labor Rights Forum, and Fontheim International, and has been a consultant to the International Labor Organization. She has designed and managed multi-country projects in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, and has developed and led multi-stakeholder initiatives with global corporations on labor compliance. She holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Michigan, and has served for several years on the University of Michigan Herb Institute's Board of Advisors. We are so grateful to have her with us today, so please join me in welcoming her up to the podium.
All right. Thank you very much. I think this is right. Everyone can hear me. I can just, all right, good. I'll proceed. So I'm Bama Athreya. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's always a pleasure to be here in Ann Arbor, one of my favorite towns in the entire country, and to be back at the University of Michigan, a really excellent institution in every way. I am grateful to the Ford School for hosting me, and I will say I am pleased to be with so many of you who are concerned about this topic, but quite devastated as to the reason why USAID is now on everyone's lips. Let me tell you, for years and years of working at the agency, we struggled to explain to people who we were and what we did. And now USAID has become practically a household word. In just the past few weeks, I've been on CNN, I've spoken to The Atlantic, I've spoken to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. I never had so much media attention until I left USAID in late January of this year. So what I want to do is have a conversation with all of you that is actually about values, right? It's about what is important to us and why we ever supported international development in the world. And so I'm going to do that by walking through a little bit of history, a little bit of what's happening right now today, and then looking forward to the conversation with Dr. Harris about what we value. And I'm going to start at the beginning, which is just post-World War II. One of the things I want to emphasize is that we've seen some real seismic shifts, as is always the case in geopolitics, in national alignments, and even in national boundaries. And one big realignment happened as a result of World War II. Not only were global economies and politics, global politics was reshaped, new alliances were formed post-World War II, new national boundaries were drawn, and in the midst of all of this, President Harry S. Truman announced what would be the predecessor to what became our international development assistance, and that was the Marshall Plan. Now, I'm going to assume everyone in this room knows what the Marshall Plan was. One of the things I want to point out about the Marshall Plan is that at that time, we provided $13 billion, that's $1948, in assistance to Europe to reconstruct. That was 3% of the country's national budget at the time. The assistance in 2024 that we provided worldwide was $40 billion, which sounds like a lot, but think about it. It really wasn't all that much growth since 1948. And it represented, just under 1% of the US budget. So comparatively speaking, we started off in 1948 in a pretty generous place as we looked at the need to deal with this new set of global alignments. Fast forward to 1961, which is when President John F. Kennedy signed the legislation that enacted a single agency, USAID, as the agency that would handle our international assistance. And what I want to emphasize about this moment in 1961 is that once again, it was actually a moment when we were addressing global realignments, this time outside of Europe. Starting in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s into the 1960s, we saw the end of colonialism. We saw nation after nation actually speak out and end colonial rule and establish national sovereignty, establish principles of self-determination. India, Indonesia, Ghana, Tanzania, the list goes on. And it was in this context of looking at all these new nations and this end to colonialism and this pivot to self-determination, as well as the Cold War alignments. And it was in this moment that we stood up an agency for international development. So, again, I just want us to think about what were our values. I'm not going to, assert what our values were at the time. I'm just going to assert that the agency was stood up at a time when we were dealing with global upheavals in terms of those geopolitical alignments. The next, 2 decades brought us to the late 1980s, and this is a photo of Lech Wałęsa, the leader of Solidarity, the Polish trade union, which stood up to its government, a government that was behind the Iron Curtain and dominated by the Soviet Union, and became the first of a series of revolutions across countries that were behind the Iron Curtain at the time, and that was the fall of the Iron Curtain that took place from the late 1980s into the early 1990s, with country after country, again, asserting its national sovereignty, its people asserting rights to self-determination, and the US seeing a dramatic global realignment as the Soviet Union, its opponent in the Cold War, came apart. And so in 1980, we had another geopolitical moment where we had to rethink what our foreign assistance was really for. What was it going to look like as we went into the 1990s and beyond? Now, I am now going to do a real fast forward to this year, 2025, and the dismantling of USAID, which happened very quickly and very dramatically in a few weeks, starting in late January of this year and through the month of February. And I show this slide in the context of having shown you the 3 previous slides because we are right now today standing at a moment of a very dramatic realignment of global geopolitics, a dramatic rethinking of global alliances, of our support for multilateral institutions and our role in the world. But this time, it's not a crisis or a rethink that was precipitated by events elsewhere, not foreign wars, not foreign struggles for self-determination, right? Not foreign struggles against authoritarianism. None of those things have happened. The crisis is starting here. The crisis is precipitated by the decision of a US administration that starts with the dismantling of a longstanding foreign aid agency. And this is going to have ripple effects throughout the world that have already begun. And that is really why we need to have a conversation today about values. We can look at the new risks that are being exacerbated by what's been happening. But the one thing I want to start the conversation with is, why are we doing this? What does this say about who we are, what we value, and what's important to us in the world? So now we're going to go into a little bit of just the weeds, because we know that, I've been working with a number, so I'll just say a couple of things before, I go on to the next few slides, because the next few slides are a bit wonky. I spent 3 years as a senior official at USAID. I worked with a number of other senior leaders in our foreign policy establishment, and all of us are pretty damn concerned about what's happening. So I'm going to use we a lot because this is not just a reflection of my views, but of the collective views of a community of people who believe that it is very important to explain very clearly to our fellow citizens, to the people of the United States, exactly what has happened. We know there's a lot of bad information out there about what's happened, and so some of this is about setting the record straight with the data that we have been able to obtain since leaving federal service. Either we have, some of us like myself left in January because I was a political appointee. Some have left since because they have been laid off. Their jobs have been made redundant. They've been put on administrative leave. They've been sent home from overseas posts where they were serving. So, you know, the we is collective, and the we is a number of people who, even though they have been removed from our foreign policy bureaucracies, remain very concerned with preserving the information about what has happened and what the effects will be, so we all can actually react to those effects. So I want to, first of all, show you, this is, you know, obviously we've been doing these situation reports every week, and this is the most recent one that I have that shows you something that, you know, has been perhaps poorly understood, and that is that 83% of all our programs have been terminated, not frozen. Everything was frozen. 100% of the programs were frozen, which means that no one was allowed to do any work. They got stop work orders. But of the 100% that were frozen, 83% have actually been terminated altogether. And the other 20%, you know, it remains to be seen. Now, you know, what I want to do with the next couple of slides is, this is so much, $40 billion, and we work on very complex, wicked problems around the world, right? We work to solve poverty. We work to solve the climate crisis. We want to take this into a couple of examples of what this means, because it's kind of hard to understand what it really means. So this is, you know, an impact counter that one of our friends and allies at Boston University put together just to look at a program that is meant to be preventing or stopping HIV, preventing the transmission of HIV. And what this researcher was able to determine is that the impact of stopping this assistance is that an adult is dying every 3 minutes and a child is dying every 31 minutes. So real-world impacts of stopping foreign aid. More real-world impacts of stopping foreign aid. Many of you have doubtless read about events in Syria, the unexpected capitulation of the long-standing Assad government that had been waging a civil war against its own citizens. Following that, USAID had been providing humanitarian assistance in Syria. One of the notable things that happened as a result of the freeze on foreign assistance that actually was fairly widely reported was that we had been, through implementing partners, paying salaries for guards that were guarding ISIS fighters. And those guards walked off the job because they stopped getting paid. Another really dramatic impact is we had been supporting this, you know, set of actors that were delivering humanitarian assistance, the white helmets, and they were reaching into every community in Syria. So all the people who were receiving humanitarian assistance that were displaced by the conflict and the crisis and are now just trying to rebuild their lives, the stoppage of aid has very dramatic consequences on their ability to restore peace in Syria. So that's just one country, one set of examples, but we could tell these stories all day long. I just wanted to give you a couple of stories because when you just look at data, sometimes you don't understand what that means to people's lives. I am going to go back to data, however, because we are trying our best to track what's really happening. And so the Center for Global Development has done an excellent job at slicing and dicing this in a different way, not by stories, not by impact on particular programs, but by looking at entire line items and what are we not doing in the world anymore. And this is going to help us with our conversations on values, right? We are no longer investing in maternal and child health. We are no longer investing in basic education. We are no longer investing in good governance, that's rule of law, and I think we'll talk more about that, or in stopping pandemics from spreading. So this is really helpful when you look at that red column on the end to say, that 85% of aid being terminated, what does that actually look like? That's what it looks like. Those are the things we are no longer doing. Now, I'm going to do one other thing quickly if it works, and that's show you a different sorry, let me go back. OK, maybe it won't work. Let's do this. That will work. OK, and I just want to show you a different visualization. So one lovely thing about working at a large government agency is that we have a number of people who really geek out on data. and are very, very good at data visualization. And what they did with all of the data that we've been able to collect so far about the stoppages is do this visualization that shows you what this means country by country. Countries are still receiving some funding. What's it for? And you can actually even look at the list of organizations that are still receiving assistance, which is enormously helpful to the folks who are trying to make sense of whether or not they're going to still receive funding, many of our implementing partners around the world. So now, I showed you all of that, and I want to go back into the slides now. Okay, to just show you one other thing, a couple of other things. So, and I'll go through this really quickly so we can get to the conversation. We also sliced and diced this by impact on each individual state. There's job loss in each state. There's funding loss in each state. Small businesses are being affected. So all of us that have been looking at the stoppage have been slicing and dicing this in all kinds of different ways to try to tell the story of the impact and how it affects even every community and every state in this country. And this is the final slide I'm going to show you. And it is from the DOGE website. The DOGE actually have a website. Now, you all know what the DOGE are, right? OK. The DOGE are the entity that are coming in and shutting down US government agencies and budgets. And they set up a website. And I just found it so interesting. I had to show you this in contrast to all of this data visualization that we've been trying to put together, because there are so many things that just stand out to me. And by the way, when I first looked at this website in late February, it wasn't even this good. So this is an improvement. They've got like a little set of tabs up top now and some color. So tell me, anyone feel free to call it. What are some of the things that stand out about this compared to some of the other ways in which I've just showed you this information? So, one of the big things that stood out for me is this is their way of showing transparency to the US public after they've taken down all of our data, right? It doesn't give you any context at all. It's just a list. How are you supposed to know whether this is good or bad or what it does? There are no hyperlinks, right? There is no attachment to contracts. There is no story whatsoever about what this means and why you should even care that these contracts live or die. So that's one thing. It's very minimal. When I first saw it, it really was just black and white lines on a screen, kind of reminiscent of prison bars. It's very minimal. It doesn't give you context. It doesn't give you any granularity to what this is for. All it's trying to do is tell you that this is what we saved. It's just money. It's just money. And it's just a bunch of numbers at that. And then the final thing I'll tell you about this, because we went in, as you can imagine, to every single line that mentioned USAID, is that it's false. It's fake. We looked at the initial, again in late February, lines that they had put up about AID contracts that were canceled. And much of it was just plain wrong. To give you just one example, the single biggest saving that they found, right, because it's all about money, is a claim that they had found and saved $1.8 billion by ending a single contract that was our monitoring and evaluation contract. And they just put the number up there. And we looked at it, we said, we know that contract was not $1.8 billion, it was $660 million. It's still a big contract, which I'll tell you about. But it was $660 million. How'd they get to $1.8 billion? Well, we found out they had counted it 3 times because they saw it show up 3 times in their spreadsheet, so they counted it 3 times. So that was something that we pointed out in the media, in the press. The Washington Post reported on that, and then apparently they backed out off of that number. But they were willing to put on their website that they'd saved $1.8 billion by counting the single biggest USAID contract 3 times. The second problem with what they counted as saving $660 million is that the nature of the contract, they did not understand that it was essentially, I'm going to give you a really simple example so you don't have to understand how government contracts work. It was like a line of credit. If you have a bank line of credit, or on your credit card for $15,000, let's make it something like $15,000, it's a line of credit. If the bank takes that line of credit away, does the bank have $15,000? Right. That's what they were saying. They were saying they had saved $660 million that did not exist because the contract did not have $660 million in it. So I tell you all of this because this is actually part of what we all need to understand as we think about what we value, whether we value, there are certain things we're going to talk about: rule of law, transparency, anti-corruption. These were all things that USAID supported around the world. They're going to be part of the conversation I have with Dr. Harris. We need to understand what is happening right now in real time with USAID because it is a case study. It is a case study in something that is happening that may or may not comport with our values as a people. And on that note, Dr. Harris, let's get into the conversation.
I just want to announce that there are QR codes on most of your tables at the end, so you can write your questions in the QR code.
Do you have a preference?
Oh, it doesn't matter. I'll sit over here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you not only for kind of walking us through the history of USAID and the role that it has served, but also getting us a bit up to speed on what's been happening since January. Excuse me. So you mentioned values several times. I wonder if we might start there. If we consider foreign assistance as an expression of our national values at an international level, how can we think about the extent to which these national values and what we're trying to express at an international level has changed over time, and what does it look like now?
This is such an important moment. This may sound like a really big question. I know, Amy, you and I talked about this in advance, but this is a moment for those big questions. It really is, because we are looking at this great shift, not only in what's happening in the United States, but potentially what's happening around the world. So if we go back to the end of World War II, it was a moment when we actually, the collective we, nations coming together from around the world in the wake of World War II, took a hard look at what we valued. And one of the things that happened at that time was that First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt sat around a table with some really, sort of profound humanitarians from around the world and composed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So at that time, we actually had a statement of our values, and it was this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was other things too. Sure. But let's just take that as a principle. So part of, I think what we need to now ask ourselves is, do we still believe in universal human rights? And does that apply here in the United States? Let's just start with here in the United States. The Declaration was based on so many different traditions, but certainly based on the US tradition that we have a story about, right? We have an identity as a people, and it goes back to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but in particular the Bill of Rights. And in the Bill of Rights, in particular, the First Amendment. And this is something that is part of the US national psyche, that we believe in these fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right? Such critical things to the founding of our nation. So let's start with that. Are these values that we still believe in and that we want to uphold? And if we do, and if they're good enough for us, are they values that we believe other people deserve as well? Self-determination, I talked about that a couple of times, right? Again, our founding story is that we overthrew a king so that we could have, self-determination and government, by the people, of the people, for the people, as Lincoln famously said. And that's part of our national identity as well. Is that something we're willing to agree is a value that we would uphold in our relationships with other countries? Should that be part of our foreign policy, right? So we've had these debates over the years. Where does human rights fit into our foreign policy and our foreign assistance? Where does what we call good governance, right, which is rule of law, again, the right of people to determine their government, these values such as free speech, free expression, where does all of that fit into our foreign policy? Like, where does it come in? It's part of our foreign policy, but how big a part is it? How much do we value it? How much are we going to stand up for it? in different countries. And that's been differently true at different times. During the Cold War, right, we had, we could get into a long conversation just about the extent to which we stood for those values during the Cold War, in what places did we not stand for those values, right? But those are things that right now we need to ask ourselves if we believe in here in the United States. Do we want to protect our free speech? And that certainly is a lively question today for anyone in a university setting, right? Sure. Will universities stand up for free speech, for free assembly, for free association? Will other types of organizations stand up for those things here at home? And if we still value those things and we believe in those things and that story of who we are as Americans, then we can get into the, and then what does that mean if we're going to remove those things from our foreign policy? Then how are we showing up in the world? Sure. And do we want those things back in our foreign policy? Do we want to say we stand for human rights? We certainly did up through December of 2024. Up through December of 2024, our US foreign assistance had the largest ever anti-corruption programming, right? Like dedication of resources to anti-corruption programming around the world. So that was a value that we upheld very recently, right? We had substantial resources for human rights, protection of human rights defenders around the world, including, and we can get into this because, you know, it was famously made a whipping boy, I think, between our political forces here in the US. Standing up for everyone's rights meant standing up for everyone's rights, which meant standing up for populations like LGBTQ communities around the world, not because we were saying we are, you know, as might have been depicted, that we were promoting, right? And I'm not going to apologize for defending LGBTQ rights. That was part of my portfolio. But this wasn't an affirmative promotion of something. This was a defense of the rights of all communities in the countries where we worked, even those that were unpopular with their own governments, because that's what human rights is. So I've gone on for a while. I better let this conversation come back to you. And so.
No, thank you very much. I wonder if we might, excuse me, spend a few minutes thinking about when this translates to an international context, in a foreign assistance context. What is the actual work of foreign assistance, of international development, right? We've talked about things like good governance, rule of law, anti-corruption programming, which are kind of big concepts and kind of big areas of work. But I find it's often useful to actually spend some time thinking about what is the actual work of international development? What does it look like to actually advance or protect human rights through development work? Yeah. And I wonder, as you share a bit about this with us, if you could also talk a bit about what sorts of kind of human impacts you've seen from this work, right? We talk a lot, as you've said, about numbers, about statistics, about headlines, but I find often that understanding international development work is very much about the kind of the people that are kind of interacting with these programs.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. I will tell you about a couple of things that are important to know and also a little bit heartbreaking. So I had these multiple portfolios we had the child protection portfolio under my offices, we had LGBTQ rights, we had disability rights and inclusion. We worked very, very closely with our education colleagues. I mean, had fabulous relationships with our education programming around the world. Because a lot of what this looked like in practice was making sure every kid could go to school, right? Going to a country where a child with a disability might just get left at home and never educated because the schools were not accessible. And saying, we will work with you, local community, to make these schools accessible to children who have disabilities, whether it's that they are deaf and need, sign language, whether it is that they are physically, are in need of access to buildings in order to participate in classes, like whatever it is, we're going to figure out how to help your educational systems accommodate these children and give them the right to just let them enjoy the right to an education. So, and the same thing, again, I'm not, I think people ask us so much about the LGBTQ programming. I mean, all it was saying these children who are LGBTQ children have the right to be safe in school, to not be harassed, not be, exposed to violence, to be safe in school. So we worked with our education colleagues to create safe an inclusive environmental setting so that school after school, whether it was in Rwanda or Colombia or, Cambodia, actually were able to bring these children who might otherwise have been left to the margins, and then terrible things might have happened to them, right? Children who are left to the margins can be trafficked, exploited, otherwise abused, and we made sure they were safe. So that's what we mean when we talk about protecting human rights in international development.
Thank you. So we've talked a bit about how international human rights and promoting international human rights kind of from a values perspective. I wonder if we might also think about how does it fit in to kind of a foreign policy agenda, right? So we have seen recently that Secretary Rubio has talked about the justification or the rationale for foreign assistance programming should be along 3 lines. Does it make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous? So I wonder if you could talk a bit about how does promotion or defense of human rights work at an international level or other types of foreign assistance work related to, let's say, good governance, for example, how does that advance, or to what extent, I suppose, does it advance this agenda? And kind of how do we think about the larger narrative that's happening at the national level about the extent to which it does?
Well, the question is also who needs to be safer, stronger, and more prosperous?
Sure.
We came in, I think, as you had read in my bio, I served twice at USAID. I served from 2013 through 2019 in a what's called a career position. I was just a regular civil servant, and I was serving in USAID Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. And then I left in 2019, and I came back in 2021 as a political appointee for the Biden-Harris administration. And as we came in, we did, we were very clear about our values. And one major value was equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion altogether, but especially equity. There was an entire executive order saying that in all US government policies and programs, we will advance support for equity, racial equity and equity for underserved communities in the US and around the world. So that was a value. So why does that make us safer, stronger, and more prosperous? So one of the things that happened as a result of embracing that value is that we got to say, who is this for, right? I mean, when we go overseas and we do these programs, who are we doing them for? Well, how are they helping our communities here in the United States? And what do our communities here in the United States? And so that allowed us to reach in and engage communities in the United States that were immigrant and diaspora communities that cared about advancing support that was helping, racial and ethnic minorities in other countries, LGBTQ communities, young people. We worked with a greater range of what is, frankly, a very diverse set of constituencies in a very diverse country. The United States is a very diverse country. But not everybody related to foreign assistance, but they could see themselves in our foreign assistance programming, especially when we reached out and really, sort of ramped up our engagement with young people and said, we know we've got to work with young people and build bridges with young people around the world. I mean, we need to think about who needs to be engaged in our foreign policy. And foreign policy had, I think, been seen as sort of a thing that certain people in certain elite circles do. And we really tried to say, if we're doing equitable foreign policy, that means it's equitable here too. It's equitable in that it represents all of you, not just the people who are in those elite circles and happen to have those particular interests. So what are you interested in? And we found that there were a lot of constituents that were interested in seeing us do this work with more diverse communities around the world.
Great. And when we think about national interest, let's expand it or perhaps zoom in a bit and think about national security specifically, right? There's been a lot of discussion about the role of foreign assistance within the realm of national security. So in early 2006, the Bush administration elevated development to one of the 3 Ds of national security. So defense, development, and diplomacy. And we're seeing now that the administration is kind of embedding the remaining components of USAID's work into the State Department in various ways. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about, first of all, how do we think about the connection between development and national security? But also, how do we think about the changing role of development within this broader picture of advancing national security across these three tools of foreign policy? And has the fact that development and diplomacy essentially now been somewhat merged into the State Department influence how we think about it?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think there's a whole conversation to be had about whether anything has been merged or whether we just have abandoned international development. So let's not worry about that piece of it. Let's really talk about the national security piece. We are, we're living in a world where we talk now about polycrises. So as I said, I mean, we've had sort of pretty consistent international, how do we want to put this, sort of an international geopolitical balance since the early 1990s. And yes, things change. Obviously, there are, countries rise and fall, nations rise and fall, and coups happen, and, other things happen. But global alliances have been largely stable. But that stability has meant that in a collective way, we have, over all these years of having, multilateral institutions and, again, these certain global alliances, and some of them are uneasy, some of them are, but we have venues where we talk regularly. We've identified these crises that are common crises, that are not my crisis, or your crisis over there in, Russia or China or Iran or wherever. They're sort of these shared crises. There's a climate crisis, right? There are pandemics that happen that represent international security crises, right? Sort of crises to our health, but also things get shaken up when you have these, what we call these polycrises, right? Things that are layered on top of each other that no one can control. So we collectively have to do our best to adapt and to share resources and to try to do what we can to strengthen everyone's resilience against pandemics, against climate disasters, right? So those, the ability of international development to address those polycrises, to play a role in bringing really deep technical expertise, as well as dollars. It's not just the dollars, but deep technical expertise and decades of understanding. I mean, famines are an example, right? A famine doesn't, in these days with global, supply chains being what they are, the Ukraine war, right, created, the risk of famine in multiple other countries. So when we look at these polycrises, our national security, establishment agrees. Right? Our Department of Defense, our allies throughout the national security apparatus agree that we need development to address the polycrises because these types of crises can precipitate wars, can precipitate conflict. And if we don't get under the root causes, we end up with more war and more conflict in the world.
Thank you. So as we had discussed a bit before when we met earlier today, I shared with you that I recently led a student trip abroad to study international development. So for those of you that don't know, the program, this is the International Economic Development Program, and we traveled to Bogota, Colombia, and we met with various actors that are involved in delivering international development work in various ways. And at the end of the trip, a student shared a reflection with me that I want to share with you because it reminds me so much of kind of the conversations that we have been having around development and the impacts of the foreign assistance changes. And I did get permission to share this. So she says that she had a fundamental realization that effective development work requires relationship building across differences of experience, perspective, and power. The technical solutions matter, but they cannot succeed without deep engagement with local contexts and needs. She says development isn't something that we do for others, but something we create with others through authentic partnership. So I can't help but reflect on her comments in the broader context of what's happening. How do we think about the impacts of foreign assistance cuts, of our changes in our foreign policy, on things like relationships and trust and authentic partnership? And certainly, you held a role recently with USAID with their Bureau for Inclusive Growth, Partnerships, and Innovation. So I'm interested in your take on the role of partnerships in international development and relationships, and how has the role of partnerships been impacted? And how do we think about, in the future, potentially rebuilding foreign assistance within the context of what these partnerships and relationships look like today?
No, so there's so many layers to that. And I think this is something all of us can relate to. If you're working with someone and you have agreed to work together, and suddenly that person just disappears, right? Your share of the work disappears as well. And, that's annoying if it's just a minor project you're working on together. But it's devastating if this was, something that your town or your community relied upon to have happen. And USAID, we're a very, very large, complex agency with partnerships with other governments. And just for instance, we were working on stabilizing conflict regions and assisting refugees in partnership with the Norwegians and the Swedish government. And their aid agencies have said they can no longer provide certain types of assistance because we pulled out and they were relying on our partnership. We had partnerships with a number of major multinational corporations who, again, had agreed to leverage their resources with ours to do things like strengthen, food supply, chains in Latin America, and just to pick in Ecuador, that was a big partnership that we had done. And so when our resources disappear, that partner is left saying, am I going to fill the gap here, or are we just going to say we're just not going to do job creation for this these communities because the partner's no longer there to do it, and the contract has been pulled out. And those are big partnerships. We had partnerships with foundations, but let's get to the community level. And Colombia is such a good place to talk about that. In Colombia, we had an agreement with the government to accompany, what's called accompany on one of the chapters of the peace agreement, and in particular to work with affected communities that were Afro-Colombian or indigenous communities. And I got a chance to visit some of those communities during my time over the past couple of years, and to visit communities that had been displaced by the civil conflict and had gone back to the indigenous communities, had gone back to their land and were rebuilding their whole communities, reconstituting their whole communities in this land that they had been displaced from, and that through the aid assistance we were able to restore. And that, rebuilding a community, think about it. It was job creation. It was saying, what are the resources in this community that, whether it's things like coffee or agricultural commodities that you could start to recultivate and then bring to market. It's creating those market chains. It's training for young people. It's reestablishment in governance. What does governance look like in that community? And so those communities were partners. They were partners because we were not doing things to them, as you say, as the quote from your student suggests. We were working with them to say, what do you need to rebuild your community? What do you need? Right? And you drive it, and you tell us. And then what happens when that partnership ends? It's profound.
Sure. It also reminds me of conversations we had with nonprofit organizations, whether they were more academic organizations focusing on research, or they were organizations that were grassroots community organizations. And certainly we have seen a profound impact on organizations that have received USAID funding. And several of them are, unfortunately, their funding was so reliant on USAID sources that several of them are no longer in existence. And the ones that still are having a pretty massive challenge to figure out how to identify additional and alternative sources of funding.
And that is, yes, that is very true. And I will add that, given the areas that I've worked in, it is incredible to me to realize the extent to which over all these years, and again consistent with this conversation on values, the enormous amount of support we gave to human rights defenders in different countries, and what's going to happen not only to the, the organizations, but to the communities that they worked with, because those communities were marginalized and were subject to rights violations. What's going to happen when they no longer have the defenders in place? The amount of support we gave to independent journalists around the world, and the importance of those independent journalists in investigating and uncovering corruption or other types of exploitation. Incredible. Like, it's incredible. When you think about the good that came of that you never measure, and what happens when you have these things that we valued so much that we became the predominant funder in these areas.
How do we think about beyond what we've already said? How do we think about the impacts of this kind of sudden cut, right? This you're saying, USAID was in some cases the primary funder, the sole funder for some of this really important work. How do we think about the implications, and kind of let's come back to a kind of US national foreign policy perspective. How do we think about the impacts and the implications even on our national security, let's say, or in terms of advancing national interest goals? What are these implications, and how do we think about them, particularly, we talked already a bit about the long term. How do we think about them in the short term?
Yeah. So in the short term, we really have we have something of an existential crisis on our hands when it comes to our national security. We do. So let's not sugarcoat that. In the absence of even just one of the things that we've talked about today, anti-corruption efforts, and given some of what I've described about the extermination of actual transparent data about billions of dollars of resources, we are looking straight in the face of a crisis of accountability, for one. And where there's no accountability, what do we as ordinary citizens expect our government will do for us if something happens to us, right? If there's no accountability, what happens if we are extorted or exploited? Right? We've just, basically taken away a lot of the architecture for anti-corruption work. What happens if it's an entity that is a U.S. entity in another country that's being extorted or exploited? Who's going to step forward? Will it be us? No. So that's not 100% what you were talking about. I think you were also talking about literally, sort of wars and militarism, and are we safer? And I think we are not safer. One of the things that gave me pause the other day is I was having a conversation with a friend of ours, just social, whose son is in his early 20s, is very interestingly working in Kyrgyzstan, which is not a country that most people would choose to go and get their first job in, but there he is. And this real dilemma caused by the fact that this is this perfectly innocent young person. He's not doing anything wrong, but we are reducing our presence around the world, okay? We are removing ourselves from the goodwill that we've had in a lot of countries because we were supporting things like peace and security work and peace building and human rights again and good governance. We've taken ourselves out of that equation, so now we're not popular anymore, okay? And we are reducing, I don't know if people know this, but we're going to be reducing our embassies, the number of our embassies around the world, quite dramatically. So places like Kyrgyzstan are not going to have U.S. embassies. So this friend who is not, not in the government, right, did not realize this, and I said, he's going to have to. I hope he's got another passport, because if something happens, he's going to have to go to another government for help, not to our government. So that's just on an individual level. You travel, you may not have a U.S. embassy to help you if you're in trouble. And that's before we even get to the what if there is conflict, what is our reaction going to be? And that's a big, question as well. What is our reaction going to be if something blows up at, let's say, Syria? If Syria, becomes a raging conflict once again because we've just pulled out the stops. What are we going to do? Are we going to hand it to Russia? What are we going to do? And these are real questions that we're going to be looking at month in and month out in country after country as we have pulled out the resources that have kept some of these places, or we're on the road to peace building in some of these places. So I just came from a peace building conference in Copenhagen last week. I think you know about that, right? So I was talking to people from Syria, people from Sudan, people from Ethiopia. I mean, crisis after crisis that they're like, you were supporting our peace building efforts. Now what?
Right. I also think about what's recently happened in Myanmar with the earthquake, right?
Yes.
So historically, the U.S. aid would have been one of the first kind of major responders on the ground, right? And we've seen that the U.S. government response has been, both limited as well as delayed, and certainly much smaller than it would have been before, and smaller than other countries' responses have been.
Oh no, let's call a spade a spade. We normally would have sent in, a first response team of several hundred people. Normally, in a context like that, the last time there was an earthquake in the region, I think we sent in 200 people. And I can't remember how many $1 billion to help with the rebuilding. This time we sent in 3 people. We sent them late, and then while they were there, they received firing notices from the State Department. While they were there living in tents on the ground trying to do a situation analysis in Myanmar. That's how little we did.
Yeah. There's also been, I think, discussion around the different skill sets between USAID staff who had done this type of work and this type of response before, and Department of State staff, which have a very different sort of tasks, work that they typically do, and a very kind of large uphill learning curve for State Department folks who are absorbing this new workload, which implies a different set of tasks and experiences. In addition to sending fewer people, we're also seeing some kind of a bureaucratic realignment that is also, I think, limiting our capacity.
Absolutely. There is a need to recognize that some of what we developed over these decades, and I think this is there's a misunderstanding that's in the general public and maybe even in DOJ that we're an ATM, right? That the U.S. government's an ATM. No, I mean, most of what we deployed was expertise, very, very, very deep expertise in everything from, again, emergency feeding programs when you are reaching starving children to how to clean up ocean plastics, to, how to prevent malaria. I mean, just so many experts that we had on hand to deal with a variety of complex situations, and that's part of what we're losing as well.
I have maybe one final question before we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And this relates to the title of the event. Oh, hold on. So the title of the event asks if we're seeing the end of U.S. global leadership. So I'll ask you that question. To what extent is that what we're observing? And in particular, what type of leadership? How would you kind of quantify or qualify the type of leadership that we're seeing kind of these drastic changes to?
Yeah, no, I think what you see is what you get. And it is a complete decimation of our expertise. Again, the people, right? No more people around the world. So when you lose that, yes, you lose U.S. global leadership, because leadership is actually human relationships. It's people, it's partnerships, it's the things we've talked about. Those people are not out there anymore. We are not leading. We are not showing up. We've withdrawn from multilateral organizations like the WHO. We will be withdrawing from other multilateral organizations. We are not going to show up in the world, and we are not going to be global leaders. So who are we going to be? Who are we going to be? And early indications suggest we are going to try to be, global, new neo-colonialist power that gobbles up Canada and Greenland and Panama. That's what early indications suggest our foreign policy actually is going to be. And I know that sounds absurd, but lots of things sounded absurd, and we didn't believe they could happen, and they seem to be happening. So there's that of we don't look like a global leader when we say we want to swallow up Canada and we withdraw from all global institutions. There is, most certainly the need to look carefully at things that are very real and that people haven't I think are not really well known in the public domain, such as the directive to establish a quote-unquote sovereign wealth fund. And we haven't even started to talk about this, so I don't want to go on and on about it. But I just want to point out that there are plans to do things that need to be paid attention to, because while all the windmills, churn over here and, sort of draw up attention, there are real proposals like let's give billions and billions and billions of dollars to Wall Street in what we're going to call a sovereign wealth fund, even though the US has no sovereign wealth. So it's just tax dollars, Amy.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for this conversation. We're going to open it up for questions, but I want to just put a small spin on this. For those who believe that this is a good step, saving money, not necessarily the way that they're counting it, but in reality, our funding is a very small fraction of our GDP or our national wealth, as you mentioned at the beginning. But there are lots of countries who, not because they're competing with us, but who are happy that the US and other countries will stop meddling in their internal affairs. So, one, what do you say about that? And then for everyone, I think this will come up, of course, I've looked at some of the questions. What can we do? We're seeing letter writing and all these other things that hasn't maybe yet moved the needle, but we want to do things and are kind of overwhelmed by what do we do?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Ambassador, for that last question in particular, the what can you do? I always love to do the what can you do. And so I'll do that, and I think you probably have some really wonderful reflections as well on like where this is all going and what is the future of how do we bring back US global leadership? Because we want to, I will just, I will start by asserting we want to have a good reputation in the world. The world, it's one world. And whether or not we're leaders, we should be good global citizens. We should just be good global citizens who are respected by other countries. So let's just hold our heads up and say we would like to be respected. At a minimum, that is our value. We want to be a country that other countries can respect for what we do. So other countries will fill the void. I think that's part of your question, but I'm going to actually sort of leave it to you because I think you probably have a really sharp analysis of realignments that will happen, right? It's not as though the US goes away and then everybody just plays by themselves in their own little sandboxes. No, they shift alliances. There will be shifting alliances around the world. And other countries will start to become much more significant regionally with respect to their neighbors and internationally. China certainly will. China is already. And that's another conversation. But the what can you do? One of the things that I uniquely would like to bring to this community as a university community is just how incredibly helpful it is to help us retain the evidence of the effectiveness of the programming. So important. Yes, there are heartbreaking stories that we care about and can tell about the children who are dying because we took away the medications that were keeping them alive. So yes, we'd like to just get them their meds. But I'm willing to step back and say what's even more important is that we not lose the knowledge of how to save those lives. And when they took down the USAID website, they also took down decades worth of evaluations of the effectiveness of our programming impact evaluations that that $660 million contract was, supporting. Yeah, times 3 was supporting. Really, really good evidence of what works. They took down our famine early warning system, which, again, was like using real-time data and predictive analytics to help get under disasters before they happen. And we need universities to do what the Boston University researcher did. We need people to take what information you can find and help us to retain the knowledge of how to solve these critical problems. What works? What have we learned? So that's one thing that everyone in this community can certainly help do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atreya and Dr. Harris, for a wonderful conversation. This is working, right? Yeah, okay. So we have a number of questions, and I will just shortlist some.
Maybe hold it closer.
Hello. Working? Okay, great. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We have received a number of questions, and I will just try to shortlist some. First is, as someone who completely agrees with the positive human impact that USAID has had internationally, those with opposing views may not place as much value on this. How do we quantify the return on investment for the American taxpayer? For example, a small amount of investment in a foreign country decreasing the need for U.S. defense spending or improving U.S. security and U.S. economic growth.
Okay, that's a great question. I am, going to invite you. You've done your own research on this too, so I'm not going to like hog all the questions. Just jump in if you would say, I would like to say something about that. I can't help it. I know that some of these are intentional. Some of what happens in the public discourse is an intentional whataboutism. And so I'm going to indulge myself in a little bit of it, which is some, information, data I had looked up over this past few weeks. As I said, I've been doing a lot of, interviews and things, about the return on investment on Doge. And what are we saving by letting them have at all these, government programs? And it is illustrative that one of the first things that happened within the first few weeks is that many of the inspector generals in US government agencies were fired. And so let's look at, there's really good data on the return on investment on inspector generals. I mean, really good. Like every inspector general, I think, it's like a 30-to-1 return on investment for every dollar they spend, right? Because they find the places where greater efficiencies are possible. They find the places where there actually is waste. And so those inspector generals collectively across all US government agencies save, tens of billions of dollars a year to the US taxpayer. They do. And Doge is making some pretty big claims that, it's dealing with waste, or it's dealing with, programs that didn't have a return on investment. I don't know that I want to even suggest that that question might be true, because there's no evidence, except for the evidence that our own inspector generals had been, showing us year in and year out, including in late 2024. People can still look up that report of the areas where we might not be getting a good return on investment. We knew that already. The inspector generals told us that every year. We knew where we needed to cut programming, pivot programming, do things differently, because we always had that evidence. So I'm just going to suggest that there's really no need for me to say anything that USAID inspector generals haven't said publicly in their annual reports for the last 50 years.
Thank you.
Perhaps, if that's all right, I'll jump in. So I'll give you perhaps a very kind of tangible example. So there's a program, a USAID program, that was implemented in El Salvador that was focusing on small and medium enterprise development. So it's trying to work with small businesses and medium-sized businesses to increase productivity. And the specific goal here was that they were trying to excuse me, they were trying to increase household income. They were trying to increase the number of people who had jobs. And this program worked with them quite a bit to think about, okay, how do we work with new potential entrepreneurs to develop effective business plans and make sure that they're able to be effective? They conducted tons and tons of international fairs where people would come to learn about different kinds of products, right? They worked with small businesses and in particular agricultural entrepreneurs to think about how can we work with their production processes to specifically strengthen them with a lens towards domestic markets and export markets. How can we make sure that they meet, let's say, phytosanitary standards? And so then, and they worked with associations. How can we provide organizations with collective support to strengthen their processes and to build these networks? And if you look then at the sales that they were able to generate, if you look at the number of additional jobs they were able to create, and you look at these numbers, you see that the comparison between the additional incremental sales and the amount of money that the project spent, I mean, they were generating significantly more via sales than the program's cost, let's say. And so, we can look at very micro level examples, but I would also encourage you to think about success or impact in terms of international development beyond simply a financial return on investment, right? Development tries to do things that oftentimes are really, really hard to quantify, right? How do you monetize protection for human rights, right? How do you monetize reduction of corruption? Although certainly you could try to find ways to do that. How do you monetize reduced loss of life, right? And there certainly are economic tools that do that, but I would encourage you to think about the ability of development and measuring its success beyond simply kind of a monetary impact, and also beyond kind of reducing it to a single statistic, right? And I would also encourage you to think about individual people and stories, right? That's the reason why USAID for so long wrote something called a success story, right? Which focused on the human impacts of what this work actually means for people in practice.
I'm going to, actually just now pivot from that to talk about something that we were quite excited about over the past few years. We did something that was new, and that is we had brought on board a chief economist who really started to drill in on cost effectiveness analysis, which is a little bit, different than just the, kind of the straight up financial, right? And it's looking at what he called the best, it was Dean Carlin, right? What are the best buys? And that was really interesting because it does, Amy, what you were saying, which is to say, look, what is the impact we want to have? But then it also does say, are we getting the best bang for the buck in the dollars we're spending to get that impact? And so the research was really great. So if we really do care about efficiency, we should have continued to do what we were doing, which is to say, let's look at two programs trying to achieve the same goal. Mm-hmm. For instance, we want more girls in school, right? We'd like to, our goal that we'd like to see is, improving education, and especially in many countries in the world, there's a big gender gap in access to education. We'd like to see if we are getting better educational outcomes for girls, right? And the cost effectiveness work was terrific because it let us really sort of take a look at, real data on the educational outcomes, right, that we hadn't looked at in quite the way before because we were just looking at, did the program work? Were there more girls in school? But they were really able to say, okay, both these programs put more girls in school, but what's the better buy here? Like, which one's really resulting in better outcomes for these girls and these communities, right? So that's the kind of work that really, I think those are the kinds of questions we really want to answer, are those. So thanks for bringing us in that direction of talking about impact.
Great, thank you. What do you think the likelihood is for USAID and or its initiatives to be reinstated by the judiciary in the short term? How about through the midterm elections in the medium term? And what about recognizing our need to address the global crisis we are creating in the long term?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. So in the short term, just for folks who don't know, It is unconstitutional to simply dismantle a congressionally established federal agency. And therefore, there are multiple lawsuits now going on, challenging both the termination of the assistance and then also the dismantling of the agency. I think, the litigation is really important because it's not about, USAID just happens to be the agency that was targeted first, right? But there are bigger questions that, again, are important for every single one of us that live in this country, and that is, do we still have a functional Congress? Does Congress still have any authority? And that's a really big question. So that's a question that the courts are, I don't know I can't predict the future, what the outcome will be, but it's just going to be very, very important to watch, to support, to be involved with, right, in any way, including these are the kinds of things that I think if you are engaging your congresspeople to ask, like, why are we ceding congressional authority to the executive branch in this matter? And does this portend that the executive branch can now dismantle the Department of Education, which it seems, intent on doing? So that's just to let people know what the litigation piece is about. Now, will it restore the existence of USAID? Likely not, because the rulings that we've received so far suggest that indeed the executive branch does not have the authority to dismantle an agency. However, it can transfer all the functions to the State Department. So that's unfortunate, but that's where we are legally. So that's the legal piece. Medium and long term, obviously you can't go back, you can only go forward. I think, these kinds of conversations are incredibly important because we need to think about what we want our role in the world to look like going forward. And is foreign assistance a part of that role? And I mean, that's an open question, right? How we show up in the world can happen in many, many ways. It can happen purely through a militarized presence. That can be a decision that this country makes, that we are going to be isolationist, and we're going to have big armies and, just not going to deal with anybody else. It can happen through commercial relationships and commercial engagement, which is another, I'm sure, the topic of many other seminars and public events here, right? Is like, what is our engagement in the global trade regime right now? What is our commercial relationship? But that's a way of deciding to engage in the world. And so, I'm not going to predict the future, but I will say I hope that we decide that among the values that we want to see in our foreign policy of the future, we actually do still care about responding to earthquakes, that we do still care about deploying those teams that help actually find survivors. That is what we did. We found bodies of people that, we found people who were still alive that needed our help. And so I hope that is part and parcel of how we think about our future engagement in the world. I think there will be something. It won't be what it was in the past, but I do believe there will be something, and it will not be the State Department that is in existence to continue to engage in foreign assistance relationships in the world.
I'll add on to that. If you look at what has been preserved and what has been cut, right? So USAID's programs were primarily implemented through contracts and grants and cooperative agreements. And if you look specifically at what is kept, what is cut, we have about 850 contracts and grants that have been preserved. And there's still a much smaller, much reduced, but considerable amount of funding that is tied to that 850, that set of 850 contracts. And so those contracts are ongoing, right? They're still being managed by implementing partners. The locus of them is changing to various different places within the State Department. As I mentioned, I recently went abroad and talked with different development actors. People still really care, right? I was in Colombia. People that we talked to in Colombia who have been doing this work for years and years and decades still really, really care about this development work and these impacts, right? This school is filled with students who genuinely care about public service and public good. And those kinds of people still exist and are still going to be working towards these really important, really big goals. I think the question is, to what extent does it, as you're saying, form a part of U.S. national or U.S. foreign policy, and what does that actually look like, and who is taking that work on? And I think that that's, and how is it going to be delivered? We see this current administration has been talking a lot about the increased use of kind of very fixed price deliverables or results-based contracting to deliver this work. And there are all sorts of really kind of big implications towards really pivoting in a way that is really substantive in terms of doing that. But the question, I think, is what is it going to look like? Who's going to be doing it? Who is going to be managing it? And I think the other big questions are, which sectors or areas of work are going to be prioritized in terms of which values, as to use your framing, which values are we exerting or manifesting through our foreign assistance programming, and what is the scope, and how do we actually navigate this through different relationships?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, so just came back from Denmark and met with, colleagues who worked in the Danish Foreign Aid Agency. There were some folks there also from the Norwegian Foreign Aid. They also just do a lot of their work through NGOs that are Danish or Norwegian NGOs, just as we do our work through NGOs, right? So that's not unusual. I mean, that part of how we deliver assistance isn't unusual for us to partner with aid organizations that are nonprofit organizations.
Sure.
And to be out there in the world. So, that's a part of this conversation as well. This is actually, we Americans are a pretty generous people. And there are, I looked this up again for all these interviews, there are a good $30 billion in individual donations to these aid organizations, the NGOs, that Americans make every year. 30 billion, right? In just like you and me saying, I want to give some money to Partners in Health this year. So this is the other thing that makes me think this isn't over. Those organizations are still receiving our contributions. There's no reason why that would change. And they're still, doing that relief for earthquakes and hurricanes and disasters and other things too. I mean, we give for other causes as well, educating girls or, supporting independent journalists. I mean, so these are all things that will change. Philanthropy will have a big role to play, and a bigger role, I think, in this moment. But something is going to happen on the other side of this, and so it is really important to look at those organizations that are delivering the work as, organizations that need to continue to have that role.
Thank you. Since we have about 5 minutes left, I would just go towards the last question, and I'm going to combine two questions for this one. First, can you please share your views on how you see humanitarian and development work will be funded and organized moving forward? And secondly, if you have any advice for the young professionals who are interested in human rights and foreign aid, how should they get involved and gain experience?
Great. So on the first question, I just want to say I don't think U.S. taxpayers should give up on the prospect of holding our taxpayer-funded government accountable for how it spends our taxes. So I'm still not, it's April, right? This has only been happening for 3 months. I really wouldn't give up the game of saying the U.S. government is no longer going to fund this stuff. Now, I wouldn't hold out hope that it will without lots of pressure, but these are our tax dollars, and one of the reasons we've been having this conversation, and I hope these conversations are happening elsewhere, is that we do get a say on whether we want that money going, to something else or going to these causes and issues we've been talking about. Because it's not coming back to your pockets, folks. That's not happening. This government, the Trump administration has already spent more in the first few months, right, than the equivalent in past administrations. I mean, no one's saving any money here. It's just a question of where the money goes. So if we want the money to go to humanitarian causes, human rights, they're still our tax dollars, and we still get some say in what happens to them. So that's part of the answer. And I think I've answered, the other part by saying there's going to have to be some pivot in the immediate term in terms of where individual donors go, where philanthropies go, where other governments go to meet the moment. I also think it's more important than ever to be involved in advocacy. So for those that are really interested in international careers, this would be a moment to look and see who is doing the advocacy in these kinds of conversations, and to sign yourselves up with the organizations that are speaking out and making the case. Right? Those organizations that are bold enough to say, we're going to take this on, we're going to take on the challenge, we're going to say this is not right and that we need to show up. The organizations that are still showing up in other countries are the ones that, and as I said, and a lot of these organizations do have private donations as well, they are the places to go. Those are the places to look for your jobs.
Thank you. I just want to thank you both very, very much. And this has been really fascinating. I want to say that Dr. Athrea will be here for another couple of days and is looking forward to office hours for those who would like to meet her. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, welcomes these conversations because the fight is real and it does take courage, but if it's important to you, find a way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
There are refreshments outside, and we welcome you all to gather and have some.
You're listening to The Current, part of the Brookings Podcast Network, found online with our other public policy shows at brookings.edu/podcasts. We're publishing new episodes of Democracy in Question podcast now, and other shows are returning soon. I'm Fred Dews. Since the start of the second Trump administration in January, thousands of federal workers have been fired or furloughed, entire agencies have been shut down, and foreign relations have been turned over from the previous administration to align with the new administration's priorities. A major development that perhaps has gotten less attention in the mainstream media and general awareness is the removal of taxpayer-funded data and statistics from a swath of government websites, including data on crime, sexual orientation, gender, education, climate, and global development. Here to talk about what she calls an ongoing data purge is Karen Groen, a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings. She's an economist who previously served as global director for gender at the World Bank Group and senior gender advisor at USAID, an agency that has been shut down by the Trump administration. Karen, welcome to The Current.
Thank you so much for having me.
You recently published a piece on the Brookings website, quote, an ode to the Demographic and Health Survey Program, the DHS. What is that program, Karen, and why have you written an ode to it?
That program is very close to my heart as both a researcher and as someone who served in policy positions, as you mentioned. Launched in 1984 and expanded over time, the DHS has collected nationally representative and open source data on a whole range of topics, including childhood and maternal mortality, child health, nutrition, malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, anemia, education, and of course, a whole swath of other topics. In 1990, questions on spousal violence were added, which was really pioneering because we didn't have a lot of information on spousal or intimate partner violence. And that was followed by a full experimental module on women's lives and experiences in 1994. And then there was other modules that were added to collect information on men's health and men's attitudes and men's behaviors. So we really got a full picture of men's and women's relationships for a lot of demographic and economic and public health issues that we hadn't had before. The data, for me, opened up a whole new field of research on issues of women's empowerment and decision-making, employment and health status, their fertility choices, as well as men's attitudes about all of those topics. And I participated in some of the very early expert group meetings to discuss how to collect data on women's empowerment and agency. I'm still engaged in efforts outside of the DHS to refine that early work that we did. And I've also used this data over the course of my career to understand the determinants of women's empowerment, their ability to make decisions over their own fertility, to access health care on their own, or to even own property, like having land or a house. And I wrote an ode to this data because of its importance, not just to research for demographers and economists and public health workers, but also because of its importance for policymaking, especially in low and middle income countries, because this data source, which is comparable across countries, we have the data for more than 90 plus countries, which is pretty amazing. And countless PhD students, I've had so many write to me, countless researchers have relied on this data over the years. And I think it's particularly important for decision makers like health ministries who use this data in a myriad of ways.
The term ode suggests to me both praise and elegy, something that's been lost.
It has been lost, and this is the saddest part. Well, first of all, I should make clear that everything that has been collected to date at least is preserved in some form or another. So we do have archives. Whether or not they'll be accessible to the range of people who have used this, and we're talking about countries like Guinea to Latvia and countries in Central Asia to the U.S., it's now gone. And I think researchers and policymakers are really trying to find ways to make sure that people still have access to that data, including code, including guidance notes, including methodologies, how we can continue to have an open access archive for that. But most importantly, I wrote an ode because it stopped data collection in 25 countries that were in the field. And it means no more data collection like what existed will go forward. So it's great to have had information on the past, but this information, just to give you one example, which is used by health ministries, will no longer be available going forward. And I can give you an example of how the DHS were used in decision-making in different countries. So data from the 2019-2021 India National Family Health Survey on menstrual health influenced the formulation of India's national menstrual hygiene policy. Data from the 2019-20 survey in Gambia on women's employment were cited by that country's vice president